Okay, so to get started with Angular, we're going to need to install a couple of things. Right? Just like for React, we install create React app, yes, so that we can create a boilerplate application. Here too, in Angular, we're going to have to install the command line interface, CLI. Right? We're going to have to install that. And we can do that using npm. We're going to say npm install. Globally, that's what -g meaning install the following command line interface globally so I can run it from anywhere in the command line, and that's @angular/CLI. So what this is going to do is going to install a single executable, the ng executable. See this ng? So that ng, I can now run it from anywhere in my command line. And ng is going to do more or less what create React app does. Actually, it does more than that. It's going to allow us to create a brand new Angular application, plus it'll allow us to run it and test it and do all sorts of things. But at a minimum, it'll allow us to create a brand new Angular application, right? So to create a brand new Angular application, you can say ng new and then the name of the application, right? That's going to take a minute or two. It's going to do the same thing, more or less what React does, right? It's going to download a template project, right? It's going to copy it locally on your machine, right? It's going to precompile it. A couple of things, going to download all the libraries that it needs, right? And then you can go, it'll create a directory for you with that name. You can go in there, and then you can start it by saying ng-serve open. Right? Again, here the command line ng is a little more powerful than create React app. It has it has a lot of commands that allow you to create a new app and also start that app. Right? You can say ng-serve open. When you do that, it'll kick off a Node.js server that's going to host your client application, and it'll open a browser window, right, and automatically point you to localhost 4200. Right, so 4200 is also a very common port in the Angular space, just like 3000 is very common in React and also in Node.js applications in general. Yes. Once you do that, just if you open up the project, you'll find that Angular is all about building components. Very much like React, right? Whereas in React, a component was just a plain old JavaScript file, right? In React, a component is just a JavaScript file. In Angular, it's a little more involved, right? A component is considered the collection of 4 different files, right, that work together to create a component, right? Not all of them are needed. You're going to need at least 2 of them. Out of the 4, you really only need 2. One of them is going to be the TypeScript. It's going to be a TypeScript file, and the other one is going to be an HTML file, right? The TypeScript file is going to play the role of the controller, right? A controller, if you remember, is where we are going to put in all. It's going to maintain the state of the component. It's going to host all the event handlers as the user clicks and drags, right? All the events are going to be handled by the TypeScript. Yes? The TypeScript will be responsible for, if you click or you type something, it will map that to some function that will modify the state of the component. And whenever the state of the component is changed, the state will be implemented as just variables, just plain old variables inside of the component. If they modify, the HTML will re-render, right? It will be notified of any changes in the model, and the HTML will re-render any changes in that state. HTML is going to this HTML is not pure HTML, right? This is a HTML that's going to have some Angular specific attributes, right? That they all start with ng. They all start with ng. And these attributes make it so that it can be dynamic, or it can dynamically render content in the. It can map content in the DOM rendered by the HTML. It can map them to state variables that live in the TypeScript. The other 2 files that are also part of the component is a optional CSS file. That CSS file is tied to the HTML. Right, so that CSS will only be applicable to that one HTML. Right, it's a design pattern where an HTML should have the CSS that is associated to that HTML as close as possible to where that component is, so that you can treat it as if it were one. all right, but in separate files. Make sense? The other optional file is a spec file. So this spec file is for unit testing. You can create all sorts of unit tests that allow you to test this component independently, all by itself. Make sure that it's behaving correctly. Again, these two are optional, but they're strongly recommended. Okay, we're going to be focusing most of our effort in HTML and TypeScript. Make sense? All right. If you want to create, you can create a brand new component by just saying that I want a brand new TypeScript file. You can say here's a hello world dot component. This is a very common naming convention that component files will have the word or the keyword component as part of the file name. Typically, we'll have the first part of the file will be some kind of feature or some description about what that file is doing, and then followed by components and then .ts. TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript, meaning a plain old JavaScript is already TypeScript. Right? So a simple JavaScript file is considered to be a TypeScript file. TypeScript just allows you to add more things, somewhat like C++ and C. Right? C++ is just a better C. Right? It's just C adding all the object-oriented stuff. Yes, but it's optional. You don't have to use the object-oriented stuff. Right? Just plain old C is also C++. Yeah, so same thing here. TypeScript is just a better JavaScript. So to create a component, again, very similar to what we had in React, we do an export class hello world component. Here we don't have to specify a package name like we did in React. We have to say export default class. Yes. Here by default you are already in the default package. Right? You don't have to explicitly say that you are in the default package. So this is export class already puts you in the default package. You can also import other things, right? So we're going to do export class hello world component, and we're going to import component very much like we do with React, right? We can import React and then import the component instead of React, right? And then we can annotate. We can do annotations in TypeScript to tell that this hello world isn't actually a component. In React, the way we do that is by extends, right? We extend the React.component, yes, and then we're a component. Here, Angular is heavily using the idea of annotations, using the decorator pattern, the decorator design pattern, right? You decorate a class or a field or a function or an attribute or a parameter, you annotate it, and it has all sorts of behaviors, yes? Right? Internally, obviously, it uses extends, right? It does an extension, but the way you invoke the behavior is by using these annotations. Make sense? Right. So this is equivalent to doing an extends React.component. Then now the component annotation allows you to do a couple of things. One of the things that allows you to do is to declare how is this component going to be referred to in the DOM, in the HTML. Now in React, it's a one-to-one mapping. The name of the class is already the HTML that you're going to use to refer to it. Yes, right. If you do a widget list component class, the way you refer to it is that you import it, and then you use that name instead of some pointy brackets, and you're done. Yes. Here, instead, you can choose what HTML or what DOM element you want to use, what the selector you want to use, and you do that by configuring the selector attribute of the component. So the component you can configure and say, how do I want to be used, the HTML tag that I want to use. Okay. The other thing that you can configure is, what do I want to render, right? What's the HTML that I want to render? Now in React, we do that by implementing the render function, right? And then doing whatever the render function returns, that's what we render. But here, we are going to make a very clear distinction that a component should not be responsible for its rendering. All right. Instead, there should be a completely separate file that does that. There will be an HTML file that is responsible for that. Yes, there is no mixing and matching here. Here we're doing we're breaking that rule we're saying that template here is this is the HTML that will render if somebody tries to whenever they reference this component. All right, we could do a template, and this is the equivalent of doing a render return h1 hello world. Yes, but typically we're not going to do this. Right, we're not going to do the HTML here in the component. Instead, we're going to be using an alternative method. Instead of template, we're going to be using template URL. Right? We're going to say, hey, this other file, right? That file is responsible for rendering. Make sense? Okay. Also notice the keyword template. The keyword template means that all these components are not meant to implement entire web pages, right? They're meant to implement small little components that can then be put together or to build even more complex components, and eventually perhaps an entire page. Yes, right. So each subset has its own little snippet of HTML. Yes, right. So we don't refer to it as a page. We refer to it as a template. It's like a little snippet, this little portion, a subset of an HTML component. Make sense? Right. We call them templates. A couple other things. For the component to actually render, we need to do some plumbing. Right, we need to do some plumbing. Now, typically, this plumbing would be done for you automatically. All right, I'm only going to show it to you once, just to point out that this happens. Right, but you would never actually have to do this yourself. Right. So this plumbing is that there is a special file called app.modules.ts. Right. This module is a configuration module. Right. It's a configuration file that allows you to register all sorts of things, right? In particular, it allows you to register your components, right? So that the rest of the application can know, oh, there's a brand new component. Oh, look, it has this template and it has this HTML selector, right? This tag, and this is how I use it, right? Typically, you would not have to do this yourself manually, right? The ng tool that we just looked at a minute ago would do this for you automatically. All right, I'm just going to show it to you once and then never again. So in app.modules, we have the configuration of our component, our brand new component. Once it's been declared in there, we can now go back and start using our brand new component. Yes, right. And the way we do it is we can refer to it by the name of the tag that we just declared. I think we called it hello world. Yeah, the selector is hello world. So to refer to it, I just use hello world. Pretty good, right? Now, where do I put this hello world? Well, just like in React, there was an entry point to the application. Remember, there was index.js, right? And if you remember, index.js did what? It loaded React. It loaded React DOM, right? It grabbed the document.get element, the root, right? A DOM element, right? And then it injected an initial component. And that component, by default, is the app component. Remember that? Right? That was the entry point to our React application. Yes? Here, we have something equivalent. Right? The entry point to our application has already been configured to be the app.component.html. Right? That's the root entry point of our application. It comes in with some default content. Right? The default content rendered an image, it renders some h1 at the top, maybe a couple links, right? We're going to blow that away. We're going to blow all that content away, and instead, we're going to substitute it with this hello world. When we do that, it recompiles, it redeploys, and it re-renders as our hello world. Everybody okay? Right? All right.